Hello, everyone. Welcome. Just want to give a few more seconds for people to log in. Let's see. All right. Well, I'm going to get started here. Hello, my name is Kelly Sharkey. Welcome to the South Carolina Community Loan Fund's Investing in Community Summit Series. The Summit Series is a monthly panel discussion focusing on the mission areas of South Carolina Community Loan Fund. I'm Kelly Sharkey, the program manager here, and this afternoon we will be discussing funding projects with New Markets tax credits. New Markets tax credits can be great incentives for investors to contribute to growth in a community. In this sixth installment of the Summit Series, we will cover in this fifth installment, my apologies, we will cover aspects of the New Market tax credit program, such as an overview of the process, eligible projects, and how to use New Market tax credits to successfully finance community development projects. We have a jam-packed hour discussion, but before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the session, we ask that you type them in the question feature on the GoToWebinar panel. We will have a 10-minute question and answer session before concluding at 2 o'clock. This session will be recorded and automatically emailed to everybody who registered through GoToWebinar. We will also post it on our Summit Series YouTube page so you can access it at any time. I have included in the handout section on the GoToWebinar panel the PowerPoint presentation for today's discussion. You can find in there the panelist contact information on the last slide of the handout. So please feel free to download that PDF for more information. So without further delay, I'm going to pass it on to our moderator, Brendan Buttimer, who is the Upstate Community Loan Officer and the New Markets Tax Credit point of contact here at South Carolina Community Loan Fund. All right, Brendan.
Great, thank you, Kelly. Can you advance the slide, please? So today we've got 4 people that are going to speak about the various parts of the New Market tax credit transaction and how it works. And we'll start you on a path to understanding a fairly complicated gap funding mechanism that's great for community development. So today we have Chris Lutzinger, who is First VP and New Market Tax Credit Relationship Manager with Truist Community Capital. Vita Searcy, founder and principal, ILS Corporate Services. Vita joins us from New York. Tyler Smith, who is with Parker Poe Law Firm. And Rory Dowling, who is with First and Main Development, who will tell you a little bit about the experience as a recipient of New Market tax credit funds. So I am not going to take any more time. I'm going to jump right in. And Chris, I want to start with you. You've been given the task to briefly tell us a little bit about what New Markets are, sort of an overview and a history of the program, and what is New Markets tax credits.
Thanks, Brendan. Pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. And thanks to South Carolina Community Loan Fund for hosting this conversation. I am going to do my best to keep this at a fairly high level so we can have more of a panel discussion on the program. But generally, and thanks, Kelly, generally this is what I like to do is compare it to the low-income housing tax credit, because the low-income housing tax credit is something a lot of folks have more familiarity to. That's a program that is a tax credit and incentive offered by the federal government for investors to place capital in support of the development of affordable housing. And it's been around since the mid-'80s and has had a lot of success and is really the primary financing vehicle to support the development of affordable housing. Come around to the late 90s and early 2000s, Congress really saw the effect and power that the low-income housing tax credit had in that mission, and said we really need something that provides capital for commercial projects. And they really put the caveat, not just any commercial project, but a commercial project that's in our low-income communities, and these communities that are not receiving the same level of investment from traditional private financing mechanisms. And so they created the New Markets Tax Credit. And so it has a kind of a funkier name, but it really is kind of the Commercial Development Tax Credit and commercial corollary to the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. It's a program administered by the U.S. Treasury through a division called the CDFI Fund. And just like any federal tax credit, it's a tax credit itself is something that somebody can use to reduce their corporate tax liability. So if you have $1 tax credit, you can reduce your federal tax, reduce paying your federal taxes by $1. So that creates an incentive for an investor to place capital in a project that aligns with one of these programs. In exchange, they take the tax credit and reduce their tax liability. And that's kind of the give and take when in these federal tax credit programs. In this particular program, it's very competitive. There are actually a limited number of tax credits out there in the marketplace every year. And so that creates several layers of competition at several different entity layers. And we'll really get into that competition theme later on in the presentation. Like I said, the New Markets Tax Credit Program is an incentive for investors to place capital in specific types of projects. And these specific types of projects have to be in what's called a low-income community. And Tyler's going to get into kind of what defines a low-income community, but that's kind of the very first filter for any project. It's got to be in a low-income community. And these capital investments must support projects that are either doing one of two things: creating quality jobs for low-income people, or providing access to critical goods and services to low-income people. And that impact to low-income people is taken very seriously in the industry across the board from all the participants, because that's really what's driving change in these communities. Kayla, if you could flip to the next slide. I always like to talk about what this means for you as a project. A lot of the folks online might be wondering, how would this benefit me? Why am I even listening to this panel? And so I always think it's really important to emphasize this up front. And it's really kind of the why when you're listening to one of these discussions, is that through the use of New Markets Tax Credits, a project can benefit from gap financing for as much as 20% of the total project costs. So that is a meaningful contribution to any project that's trying to raise critical capital that aligns with the mission of this program. But you can see it is a gap financing tool. It's up to 20%. So any project is still going to have to come to the table with about 80% of their project financing, but this is still a meaningful piece. The 20% is not a mandated number. That's kind of a ballpark estimate based on a variety of different factors. But it is paired with your owner equity, your borrowed funds, any other grants and public funds to really pull together your full 100% capital stack. What is beneficial about this 20% though is that generally it comes to you, it can be subordinated to other lenders. It's at an incredibly low interest rate, say 1 to 3%. It's interest only. And it's interest only for a loan term of 7 years, and we'll get into why 7 years is generally that interest only term. And then at the end of 7 years, a portion or all of that investment may not have to be repaid. And that's where a real subsidy can be realized for you as a project sponsor trying to raise capital for a critical project. Next one, Kelly. So this is really the nuts and bolts of, how does this program work? And it's going to underpin and or emphasize all the things that my colleagues are going to mention today. And once we walk through kind of these 4 key steps, we're going to go into a little bit about what are all the roles. As you'll hear me refer to a lot of different terms in these steps that you may not be familiar with. The good news is, while it is a federal program, the federal government decided to essentially stay out of picking which projects are going to benefit from this tax credit incentive. And instead, they decided to delegate all the authority to the private market. And they did that by creating a kind of official certification that entities who want to participate in deploying this capital can get. It's called a Certified Community Development Entity, or CDE. And when these organizations get this certification, that allows them to apply once a year to the U.S. Treasury for tax credit authority, or the ability to place tax credits in projects. And that is a highly competitive process. Every year, only about a third of the applying CDEs are successful in winning tax credit authority. And there's generally, this year is actually going to be $5 billion of tax credit authority this summer, which is the largest that's been awarded in many years. But it is a very competitive process, but that means there's a limited amount of tax credits out there in the marketplace. So if a CDE is successful in getting tax credit authority, that's authority that allows them to then go out and search for qualifying businesses and real estate projects to provide this subsidized financing to. This is another layer of competition that we'll get into as a project. As a project, you're competing with all the other eligible projects to get the attention of these CDEs who have tax credit authority, to get them to ultimately commit their limited amount of tax credit authority in your project. And, step 3, if you're ultimately successful in getting a CDE or multiple CDEs in many cases to commit their tax credit authority to your project, that is actually not tax credits that you can use yourself. It's tax credit incentive that allows an investor to place capital in a project. And excuse me, there's some plumbing work going on in my house, so you might have heard that. Casualties of working from home here, but that allows an investor like Truist, which is my primary role, to invest in your project in exchange for those tax credits the CDE placed in your project. So you as a project sponsor benefit from an upfront capital infusion from Truist, and in exchange, Truist benefits from receiving a stream of federal tax credits over a period of 7 years. That's that 7-year number. The good news is our financial return, my financial return as an investor, is 100% coming from the receipt of those federal tax credits. So at the end of 7 years, if I've received all the federal tax credits that I anticipated, I can actually tell you, the borrower, that upfront capital infusion I made with you 7 years ago, you no longer have to repay that because I've received the return that I was anticipating just through the receipt of the federal tax credits. And that's really where the magic happens in this program, because I'm not looking to you. I'm being shielded from the economic risks of your project, and my economic return is coming from federal tax credits, not the underlying economic performance of your project. The proceeds the money that I'm investing up front, it actually comes to you as low interest only debt. And that debt exists for 7 years, 1 to 3%, as I mentioned before. And that's at the end of that 7-year period, that compliance period, you may not have to repay all those funds. And so those are the kind of the 4 key steps in how this capital goes from all the way up at the federal government, all the way down to your potential project. Kelly, if you want to flip to the next one. This is a slide that you heard me mention all these different key roles in the program. And I would say they all kind of revolve around you as a project. And a project in this program is called a qualified active low income business. And Tyler's going to get into more of what that official definition is. But you'll hear people use the term QualiC-B. That's the project that's receiving the subsidized financing. And you heard me talk about the CDE. The CDE, takes the shape of a variety of different forms. They can be located all across the country. They're officially certified by the CDFI Fund. Examples can be not-for-profits or for-profit entities with the mission to serve low-income communities. They can be affiliates of cities with an the Economic Development Authority of a city. And they can also be affiliate of a bank. Truist has our own CDE called SunTrust CDE. The CDE's name has not changed actually yet post-merger. But they can really take a variety of different forms. South Carolina Community Loan Fund, your host today, is a certified CDE and plays that role of placing tax credit authority in projects. These CDs have defined geographic areas. So South Carolina Community Loan Fund obviously is focused on the state of South Carolina, but there are other CDs that are multi-state, regional, or national. So there could be a CDE in California that's interested in your project in South Carolina if it's got the right community impacts. And that incentive for CDEs here is that they do earn fees for placing this tax credit authority into projects. Some of those are for-profit fees. Some of those are rolled into more small business loans and further the mission of these organizations. And you can find a whole list of the CDEs on the CDFI Fund website, which actually has some pretty great information for accessing additional points of contact at CDEs. An investor, which is primarily what my role is usually a financial institution. And that's because we have large tax liabilities. We also have a number of other factors that make sense for us to play a role as an investor. We're incentivized by these federal tax credits. As I mentioned, that's the key, the crux to the whole program. But we're also incentivized to receive Community Reinvestment Act credit, which is something regulated financial institutions need to demonstrate they're serving their communities. And we're also at Truist a purpose-driven bank with the purpose of building and improving lives and communities. And so these investments are very much purpose-driven investments as well. That's why we actually dedicating staff and resources in this space. There's easier places to deploy our capital, but this is one that we really drives strong community impacts across our banking footprint. That 7-year federal tax credit, it comes to us a little bit by little bit each year. And so when we're making an investment, we're not making it dollar for dollar per credit that's available in the project. It's something less because, we've got the risk of making that investment up front, but receiving it little bit by little bit over 7 years. Our main concern as an investor is avoiding tax credit recapture. And that is essentially all regulated by the CDFI fund. It's a high penalty, but a low risk because it's really how are we complying with the rules and regulations of the program. In addition to being an investor, obviously, this investment results in 20%, potentially up to 20% of your capital stack. You still need, as a project, 80% of the financing. And in many cases, that means you may have to borrow money from a traditional lender, which may be Truist Bank. So that is another role that Truist could play in one of these transactions. So you have the CDE, the investor, potentially a lending institution, all working together to deliver capital to your project, which again is called a Qualic B in this industry. And I'm going to transition back to Brendan, and I think I know I complicated things for everybody as they heard all those different things, and hopefully he's got some answers with Vita in a second for you.
So Kelly has an exam that she's going to give all of you at the end of this, so I hope your notes are good. Thank you, Chris. And yes, this is an alphabet soup. It's complicated. It's a federal program. Luckily, we know somebody who can help. So, Vita, talk a little bit about what you do, how you help, say, a community center that needs to get off the ground, or some sort of business that needs help financing a major project in a low-income community. What is it that you do, and how can you help?
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background. So I started out working for a national CDE, a CDE that was focused on investing in projects nationwide, but primarily in the Southeast. I worked for that CDE for almost 7 years, managing their investments in different projects, various projects, like I said, basically focusing on the Southeast. After that, I went over and I worked for Chase. I was an investor, had to compete with folks like Chris for projects to invest our tax credits in, but I managed Chase's New Markets tax credits investments throughout the Northeast and the Southeast, but I did primarily focus on the Southeast. I'm an Alabama girl, so I'm speaking to you from New York. I live in New York now, but I'm from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So I take great pride in closing on projects in the Southeast and helping those projects in rural communities. In fact, I met Tyler on a project that we closed together in Alabama. So After that, after I left Chase, I worked for a consulting firm for almost a year. And because of this experience, because I've worked with so many different CDEs and also so many different investors and worked as an investor myself, I found that a lot of folks were calling me up and asking for information about projects and how they could get those projects financed. So I decided to go out on my own and set up shop as my own consultant. I like to choose my own projects. I love projects that are meaningful to the community. It means a lot to me to close on a project that will help a community. And being on my own, I can choose projects that I think will not only be able to garner the allocation that they need, but will also provide vast community impacts to a community. So as a consultant, part of my job is to know who to connect a particular project with. So I'm just going to start by, there's a tag phrase, location, location, location. When someone approaches me with a project, typically the first thing that I do is I will go either to, they're one of two mapping tools, and they're all contained within this project presentation. They're both contained within this project presentation. I typically map on the CDFI fund mapping tool. I use the address or the census tract to determine whether or not that project qualifies for new markets tax credits or qualifies as severely distressed. And remember, the CDFI fund is looking to lift up impoverished communities. So the level of distress, it really means something. It means something to the CDEs. 75% of the projects that have been funded in the past few years have been projects that sit in an area of severe distress. So the first thing I do is I speak with the project team about their suitability for new markets. And then I reach out to CDEs that I've worked with, CDEs that I know that might be interested in a particular project. Now, Chris touched on this a bit when he talked about how competitive it is for CDEs to win a new markets tax credit award of allocation. And typically, CDEs will choose different types of projects, which Tyler will get into more detail about which types of projects make for good new markets projects. But CDEs will decide, maybe they want to focus on healthcare. Maybe this particular CDE, another CDE wants to focus on manufacturing projects that will bring a ton of jobs to a rural community. And it's my job to know what CDEs will be the best fit for your project. I worked with a CDE on a panel presentation, and they talked about a marriage. And you need to know who the players are in the industry so you can make sure that you marry the right CDE with the right project so you can come together and find all the allocation that you need to fund a particular project. So I think that's probably one of the best things that I bring to the project team. I also typically, I educate the project team about new markets. I'm their go-to person. If they have questions about how the program works, perhaps they need to explain to their banker because they're using a loan to help leverage the project. Perhaps they need to explain to a donor who is donating into the project to create that leverage, that 80% of financing that they need. I speak to those individuals, or I speak to those organizations about the new markets tax credit program, how it works, and how we can get them comfortable with the investment in the new markets program, and go after the 20% in net benefit for the project. So the slide that you're looking at right now, it just talks about the different people that I liaise with when I'm putting together a project. Of course, I'm the consultant, so I bring all of these parties together. I work with different investors because it's interesting. Most of the time, project teams, they think they don't realize that the person that you really the organization that you really want to attract to your deal, to your project, first and foremost is that CDE, because they determine where the allocation will sit. And once you have your allocation rounded up, then the investors will decide if it's a good project for them to either invest in, or for them, most of the investors have their own CDEs, and they may actually place allocation into your project as well. So it's my job to make sure that all of the investors and all of the CDEs know about your project, they know the merits of your project, and if need be, those investors and those CDEs can come together and give you the best pricing in some cases for the tax credits, and also even with CDEs charge fees to be involved in projects. So we want to find the CDEs that are the best fit and typically have the lowest fees for your project. So that's also part of my role. I typically also advise on legal counsel. I want to touch on this really quickly because it's sometimes when a project is interested in new markets, you may have your own legal counsel that you have worked with in many different projects that you'd like to bring to the table. But typically, you're going to need an expert like Tyler, because new markets is it's not like anything else in this industry. It's very complicated. It's guided by the tax code, and you're going to need someone who knows the ins and outs of that tax code and can help you close on this particular type of financing. I've had projects, especially as an investor, where we had where the project team brought in legal counsel that wasn't versed in new markets, and maybe a month or so down the road, we had to switch them out for an expert like Tyler. The accounting team. So talk a little bit about the accountants. The accounting team is hired primarily by the qualified. That's you, that's the project team. But they provide projections, which the entire team, legal, the investors, everyone refers to these projections to ensure that that closing will take place and we will close under the terms of the new markets tax credit program. That we haven't done anything that doesn't conform with the tax code and the guidelines of the CDFI fund. And then lastly, on this list of contributors, you have the CDE. As I said, they're the star here, the CDE. It's a lot of work, a lot of effort for them to put together an application and to apply. And if they're interested in your project, they're the ones that you really want to attract, because once you have the CDE attached to your project, then everything typically will fall into place after that. And we can go to the next slide. Great. And here we are again, we have assembling the deal. You have the consultant working with the Qualic B and putting together the allocation and bringing all of the participants together. You have the accounting team, which also I'd have to say they work with all the participants as well. And you have legal counsel who helps guide the Qualic B and the project team through the new markets tax credit transaction. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I think all of us agree this is not a project for on-the-job training for lawyers or accountants. And I think all of us feel much more comfortable when there's an experienced consultant in the room who, because most of the Qualic Bs don't do these transactions on a regular basis. So we like to see every little bit of extra help just makes it that much smoother. So thank you, Vita. So Tyler, we're going to talk about what types of projects qualify and how we know that. So why don't you walk us through that?
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you to the Community Loan Fund and my co-panelists. This is just a great opportunity. I hope everyone is getting some good information. Indeed, Brendan, I'm going to hop in, talk about the kind of projects that qualify, and then some related considerations and examples of types of projects that we see, and maybe a particular emphasis on South Carolina. Vita foreshadowed location, location, location. And on your screen, you have South Carolina and, a bit of the border states. And if it's either a cream-colored census tract or a red-colored census tract on this map, then you're going to be in a qualifying area for a new markets tax credit transaction. The cream color qualifies, the red color also qualifies, but those are what we refer to, as Vita mentioned, as severely distressed census tracts. And there's some bonus points there, and we'll touch on that a little bit more in the next slide. So how do you qualify? Well, first off, I should say the low-income communities that are qualified, they change from time to time, every so many years, based upon the census or the American Community Survey. And the metrics that are going to be looked at are relatively straightforward, and you go to one of those mapping tools. The link will be right here on your screen and in the materials if you download. But in general, a low-income community, or LIC, lots of acronyms, means any census tract if the poverty rate is 20% or higher, or the median family income for the tract is 80% or less of the applicable area median family income. That gets you into the ball game. If you're not in a qualifying census tract, on rare occasion, you may not give up hope. We have what are called targeted population deals, special rules for what are called high migration rural counties, things of that sort. So maybe not completely give up hope. We worked on a transaction in North Carolina with a very large fish processing facility, wasn't in a census tract, but it had a substantial number of employees residing in low-income areas that would go into the plan, and we qualified the deal. I'm not aware of any targeted population deals done in South Carolina, but that's something that's out there. So, Brendan, that's the location question, and maybe Kelly, on the next slide, we can talk more about the projects themselves. So getting a little more granular, what type of projects qualify for the NMTC? And the good news is, a lot of times the tax code or incentive programs will say you can do A, B, and C and nothing else. Well, in the new market tax credit space, under the tax code, it's defined on a non-exclusive basis. So it's virtually any trade or business, with some limited exceptions that we'll touch upon on the next slide. You can be a nonprofit organization, or you can be a for-profit organization. Another categorization is between real estate development and leasing, or operating businesses themselves. And here we have a good litany of some examples, some of which Chris and Vita touched upon, but certainly manufacturing, industrial, and distribution. For example, in South Carolina, we worked on a carbon fiber recycling facility. That's a good example with good quality jobs, good environmental outcomes, things of that nature. Healthcare, shopping centers, again, an example of a deal from a number of years back was a project in Brendan's neck of the woods where the folks in the low-income community were literally having to take taxis to go get groceries, or take taxis to go get their clothes washed, and things of that nature. And so the subsidy of the new markets allowed a shopping center to come and lodge itself into that community. It was really beneficial. Oh, my light just went off. Hold on. Sorry about that. I have to get up and do a little dance about every 20 minutes to make sure my light stays on. So speaking of green outcomes, research incubators. We in South Carolina have seen a university-related deal, a private deal or two of incubators. Retail, things like restaurants or hotels can be appealing to CDEs, particularly and primarily if good jobs and maybe potentially part of a larger economic development project. Educational facilities in South Carolina, we've seen charter school, we've seen a Catholic school in a very economic distressed area. Community centers, YMCA, office facilities of various types. There are a few right outside my window, for example, that were done with new markets. Museums, children's museum deal, cultural and historic museum deal. Hotels, I had mentioned, childcare, they can be coupled with other incentives like historic tax credit projects, and Rory's going to show up and knock that one out of the park. You can do mixed use, residential rental with other, for example, retail, office, things of that sort. But there are restrictions there. Not more. There's a gross income test. Not more than 80% of the gross revenue from the project can come from dwelling units. So you can have the mixed use, but you have to really mix that, get that test together. And CDEs and investors, to get comfortable, are probably going to buffer you down from that 80% to something more like 70%. So it's even less likely that you're going to blow through that threshold. And the list goes on. So, we've talked about some legal aspects virtually any trader business. And I want to go back and circle what some of the things Vita was talking about and Chris, this is a competitive process. CDEs are truly looking for community benefit, and it's one of the real appealing aspects and attractive aspects of the program. There are not necessarily bright lines, but there are definitely some highlights. CDEs, as Chris mentioned, they have their own goals. CDEs are required to have a community advisory board that's representative of the community they serve, their service area. When they apply, it's a voluminous process to be a CDE and apply to the CDFI fund. And in their application, they're going to tell Treasury or the CDFI fund what they're going to do should they be awarded a new markets allocation authority. And when they go back next year to reapply, they want to make sure that they've had some devotion to what they said they were going to do in the pipeline section or other aspects of the application for the following year. So community benefits important on many levels. Some examples of factors, certainly quality jobs. That's a big one. Are the jobs accessible to folks in the community? Are the wages good quality, living wages, benefits, job training? You'll see, some areas where new markets might help subsidize on-site facilities like, childcare or even potentially healthcare. There's an emphasis on deeply distressed or those severely distressed communities if you're in one of the red census tracts. And unlike a qualifying census tract that's 20% or more poverty rate, to be severely distressed, we need to see 30% or more poverty in the census tract, or a median family income of 60% or less of the area. Or lastly, the third prong is you can make it if your unemployment rate is greater than 1.5 times the national average of 8.3%. That's a lot of weeds, but that's why you have folks like, Chris and Vita and myself to kind of help sort through those sorts of things. There is an emphasis, as Vita pointed out, on non-metropolitan areas. The program's really evolved into a push more projects into those areas. For example, in South Carolina, there really was a good volume of sort of downtown projects, including, the cast of characters, Greenville, Columbia, Charleston, Spartanburg, elsewhere, and so forth. And we still see projects, a good bit of projects of that type, but the CDEs, let's just say, get bonus points if they lodge a project into a non-metropolitan census tract. And if you're in a non-metropolitan census tract, then you're automatically deemed severely distressed per the bullet point that preceded. Environmental outcomes, I had mentioned, if you're in an MUA, a medically underserved area, that can really help. We had a project for a community center, and the new market subsidy allowed bringing in into a portion of the facility a healthcare project focusing on women's healthcare, in particular mammography for low-income folks. And so that was really, really kind of neat. Healthy foods, if you're in a federally designated food desert, as an example. And then other federally designated zones of distress, opportunity zones we hear a lot about, a FEMA designated disaster area. Those are all good things for CDEs. And then there are other considerations. I didn't mention brownfields. There are other things like that can come into play. Now, the next question is going to be, what types of expenditures can the new market subsidy go towards? And what we generally see is typically good old project finance. Broad array of expenditure types are allowed, but we see a lot of capital expenditure, land, building, furniture, fixtures, equipment. You can rehabilitate an existing facility or existing property. But basically, it's a project finance concept that we generally see. Another thing that's helpful for a quality or a project coming into the process is it does take a village to get the deal done, but fortunately, you usually find that a good bit of the fees, if not most or all of the fees for the accountants, legal, consulting, all the things that Vita was walking us through, can come from the closing of the new markets itself. The new market tax credit transaction will result in proceeds to the borrower, to the project, and they can include closing costs. We can reimburse prior expenditures. You might be partway through a project. You might be a good way into a project, and the guidance that we've received from the CDFI fund gives us a 2-year look back period to reimburse the Quality project for prior expenditures. Now, there are some things that come into play. The main thing is just to make sure that they're very well documented, the dates where it needs to be, invoicing, proving them up, and basically a cost review to make sure that everything's in place. But you do have that opportunity. And then lastly, maybe a quick spoiler alert for my friend Rory, is we can combine the new markets tax credit with a host of other types of incentives, federal, state, or local. There have been multiple historic tax credit projects in South Carolina, and they're really neat to do. It's great to see those types of projects be rehabilitated and restored to the low-income community. There are state historic tax credits as well, abandoned buildings tax credits at the South Carolina level. You may see some deals in the Southeast where there are textile mill rehabilitation credits, and so those deals are kind of neat. Now, if we go back to the top left of the slide, we see virtually any trade or business, but I kind of said we were going to take a few of those away. So Kelly, on the next slide, we're going to do that. So what projects do not qualify for the new market tax credits? And what we have is a list of things that most all of these, the last one is farming, but otherwise these bullet points come into a statute that's been around for a long time. It preceded the new market tax credit code. It's used for a number of purposes. I think originally qualified small issue bonds, and here they are. So it's simple to play golf. It's simple to go to a country club, a massage parlor, a hot tub, a suntan facility, racetracks, or other gambling. And then this is a quote: stores, the principal business of which is the sale of alcoholic beverages for consumption off premises. And that's a mouthful, pun not intended. We typically don't see too much concern or problem, as you can imagine, with a project that a CDE would be attracted to, that would hit some of these bullet points. The closest thing that I've come to was in South Carolina. There was a mixed-use facility, and a number of weeks into the deal, they landed a new tenant. It hit the paper, and I woke up and saw the paper and was kind of concerned because it was a part of the facility that was going to be leased to tenants that were going to bring in beer aficionados. You could work with your own yeast, make your own beer, take it home, and so forth. So we, the deal team did some analysis. They got comfortable. This is part restaurant. It's not really a cash and carry liquor store. They serve food, other factors. So we ended up being okay with that. But, overall, you typically don't have a sin business concern. Most all farming is excluded, and again, it's not a statutory sin business, but it's separately excluded under a tax code provision. So as a wrap up, you have the legal rules, virtually any trade or business subject to some takeaways. You then have what the CDEs and investors are looking for, with a focus on community benefit. Any folks on this panel reach out to, they can help determine whether the project might qualify, kick around some, potential CDE concerns, things of that nature. And so towards the community benefit aspects of the project. And before I hand it back to Brandon, Chris, you probably are versed in statistics as far as South Carolina is concerned, and the great types of things that these types of projects have done in our state.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. That was a great rundown of just the sheer variety and breadth of the types of projects that can be supported with this financing. And I just pulled some stats briefly before the workshop on the New Markets Tax Credit Coalition website. And through the New Markets Tax Credit program, 16,000 jobs, quality jobs, have been created in South Carolina alone. There's been 93 projects financed, really spanning that full breadth of what Tyler covered, and about $2.1 billion of capital investment just in South Carolina alone from the program. So I thought that was a good way to wrap up that impact to the state and before Rory dives into a really impactful project that he was involved in South Carolina.
Thanks, Chris and Tyler. So Rory, bring us home. You're the developer. Tell us about your project and the challenges you faced and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan, and great to be here. I want to talk to you all about a really important project that we are in the middle of right now, rehabbing in Winnsboro, South Carolina, Fairfield County. Imagine, like a lot of the people here today, you're thinking about how can we bring a new market tax credit project to our community. Well, I was in the same boat about a little over 2 years ago. I focused most of my development on building public-private partnerships. We have done a lot of historic tax credit work in the past, but I did not know a whole lot about new market tax credits, but knew from the outset of wanting to get this project feasible that we were probably going to have to tap into that resource. So you all may be familiar, in about 2017, Fairfield County got some pretty bad news from SCANA. They were building the VC Summer nuclear plant, a $12 billion nuclear plant. About 5 years in, they notified Fairfield County in the middle of 2017 that they were abandoning that project due to budget overruns and schedule delays. At the time, Fairfield County was banking on about $80 million of additional property tax revenue annually from that plant. And they had deferred all previous property taxes over the last 5 years. That $80 million was going to be about 3x what they were currently bringing in. So it was a huge stream of revenue that they were banking on. And one of the things that the community was planning on doing with that revenue source was building a new county complex, a new facility, because the current facility that they operate under is severely undersized. It wasn't built for that purpose. It is deteriorating rapidly. It has mold everywhere. The sheriff's department operates out of the basement. So they were in dire need, or are still in dire need, of a new county complex. And so around that time, when the bad news came, the town was also talking about demolishing this beautiful school that you see here on this slide. One of the great assets in downtown Winnsboro. The neighborhood was sort of sick of it being abandoned, and it had been that in that top picture. It's been in that state for about 30 years. So the building was about to be demolished. At that time, I started talking with the county about how we may be able to tap into some of these new tax credit programs to revive this building and have it be the county complex and significant community center. So that's what we are doing right now. We're in the middle of renovating this historic building, $13 million project, and it will house the county administration offices, the sheriff's department and 911 call center, parks and recreation offices, as well as park and recreation uses in the old gymnasium, an early childhood development center, as well as Fairfield County's first visitor center. And the way that we structured this is that we will actually own the building for a period of 7 years, and the county will lease the entire building from us at a lease rate of about $12 per square foot. And the reason why we did this structure, one was we needed to buy the new market structure, but it also allows us to tap into and leverage these tax credits, like new market tax credits, as well as historic and abandoned building tax credits. And what it means, and I'll show you on the next slide, is that at the end of the day, instead of the county financing this project themselves, which, by the way, they would have been unable to do because of their lack of revenue stream to do so. They would have been unable to take on that debt obligation. We are able to keep their annual rent payment about 75% less than what they would have paid in annual debt service if they were to have built a new facility themselves. So if we go to the next slide, Kelly. This shows an overview of what the finished product will look like. So you can see the historic school building on the left there will be the administrative offices, as well as the sheriff's department and 911 call center. The old home in the top of the image, that's actually that's the oldest building on site, originally built in 1880. It's an old teacherage building for the original school there. That will be Fairfield County's first welcome center. You can see where we're going to put the council chambers, as well as a community theater in the old historic theater space. This will be really the only theater space in the county of this size. And then we are renovating the old gymnasium, which will be used by Parks and Rec. They do a lot of programming for not only the younger population, but also the population 55 and older with Zumba classes, yoga, training classes, and they're going to be getting brand new facilities for that. And then, of course, the older cafeteria there on the right is being turned into an early childhood development center. Next slide, Kelly. So this project took a long time in the making. I want to talk about the importance of bringing in new market tax credits. We originally were looking at this purely from a historic tax credit standpoint, but once we really started talking to the county to understand what their ability was in rent payments, it became clear that there was a significant gap in our ability to make this project financially feasible. So, before we went down the new market path, we talked about, okay, maybe we just do the school building or just the school building and the cafeteria and mothball the other buildings to a later date. But that wasn't really, wasn't really the vision of having a beautiful new community center and with two vacant abandoned buildings behind it. And so it became clear that in order to get this project done, we were going to have to tap into the new market tax credit resources. And so what you see here is that of the $13 million that were used for this project, we were able to get about well over 50% of the project cost financed through tax credit equity. So that includes about $2.7 million in new market tax credit equity, thanks to an allocation, the $12 million allocation from Brendan and Kelly and their team at South Carolina Community Loan Fund. And then we were able to also utilize the historic tax credit, which I mentioned. So we got about $1.7 million in federal historic tax credits, about $750,000 in state historic tax credits, and then about $1.7 million in South Carolina abandoned building tax credits as well, which is a program that's unique to the state of South Carolina. And if you don't know about it, I encourage you to look into it because it's a very powerful tax credit. And then the remaining sources were made up through the development team. But you see here, at the end of the day, we were only having to go out and really cover the debt service for a $5.5 million construction loan, and that's what we that was the plug, is we were trying to tie the county's lease payments to what it would take to cover that debt service for the construction loan. So as we were able to bring that loan lower, we were able to keep their annual lease payment lower as well. So it's a tremendous case study, I think. It took a long time in the making. And I know, Brendan, you may have a couple of questions for me as far as how it all came together that I'm happy to go into.
Sure, and I will point out too, in Fairfield County is considered part of the Columbia MSA, so you may not think of it as a metropolitan area, but this is not considered a rural project, which is a little bit challenging, to be honest with you. I'm gonna, and Roy, thank you so much for that. I guess really quickly, if you can just very quickly talk about the look and feel of the process, and then if you have questions, please submit them in the box and we'll be glad to get to them. I know we're running really close on time. So Roy, if you can give a very brief summary of sort of what it looked like putting everything together.
Absolutely. And then I'll say, from the beginning, again, we thought we were going to sort of keep this in our realm of expertise with historic tax credits and working with the local government, but it became clear from the early going that we needed help. So we worked with, we brought a consultant on in the early days, in the beginning part of 2018, TAG Group out of Greenville that does similar work to VIA, and it was really a crucial step that we took. I can't say enough how important it is to bring people on board at an early stage that just understand the nuances of this program and how to navigate it, because we were really lost. I remind our consultant often that I think probably 50% of my questions are geared towards what his job description is, but the other 50% are just, I call them when feel stressed out about anything related to the project, because he usually talks me off the cliff and brings me back down to reality. But it's important to have that team in place. And when I say team, I mean, it's all those aspects that Vita was talking about earlier. It's the right legal team. Now we worked with Tyler and his group at Parker Poe. It's the right accountants. Obviously, it's the right general contractor, the right architect that understand the complexity of these projects as well. And then, of course, it's just bringing in the right CDE and the right investor on the back end. It's a process. This project was about 2.5 years in the making to get to groundbreaking. We started our in-depth closing calls probably 5 to 6 months before that. I remember getting on those calls with my partner and just counting the number of people. I mean, we had 34, 35 people on these closing calls. We had 5 different legal firms represented. So, you can imagine what we were really doing is counting the number of lawyers and trying to add up how much each of these calls were costing us. But it is a massive team that comes together for these projects, and it's important to get that team plugged in on the early side, so that everybody's coordinating, because there are a lot of moving pieces. There's just a lot of timing aspects that need to be met that some other redevelopment programs don't quite have. So yeah, it's a process. But I mean, without it, again, going back to how important it was to get that $2.7 million of equity. Without that equity, this project doesn't happen. Fairfield County is still having to operate in a building for the foreseeable future that is just inadequate. So it's going to be an incredible finished product right in downtown Winnsboro. It'll bring 120 people, employees on a daily basis to a main street that has struggled to keep restaurants open, and will also be a centralized location, community center for the residents, so that they're all over town.
And thank you, Rory. And again, Rory's project is a good example of why you need seasoned consultants and attorneys who know these projects, because they do get very complicated, but when they work together and they know each other, there's a lot of trust that's built. We've got one question, and I'll throw this out to whoever wants to answer it, but just talking about tax credits in general, what are tax credits threatened at all by the new administration that's coming in January? Or somebody had mentioned this was going to be a big year for credit. So can you explain a little bit about that, and in any insight on where the Biden administration might be with tax credits?
I can take that question. I just recently sent information to a few of my clients. If you go to the Biden website, his webpage, he actually references New Markets tax credits, and their administration is fully behind making the program permanent, and making it permanent at an increased amount at $5 billion per year. They are 100% behind it. And that would make everyone in this industry very happy, because every year the New Markets tax credit program has to be reauthorized. And if it does become permanent, then we wouldn't have to go through that process.
Yeah, I know historically, it's had bipartisan support. It's never been a permanent program. It's been renewed every time it's come up. We'd love for it to be a permanent program. There is one more authorized year. This summer's $5 billion increased award, but we're all optimistic about the economic plans being put forth by the administration, and hope to see that extension or permanency made sometime in 2021.
And I think that was it for questions. Kelly, would
Yes.
you like to take us home?
Sure, yes. That was a jam-packed hour-long session, and it's amazing that we were able to get all that information in such a short amount of time, because I know we could go on for hours talking about this. So I just want to thank everyone, the panelists, and our moderator, Brendan, for being so thorough and explaining everything. I do have everyone's contact information up on the PowerPoint right now. So please, reach out if you have any questions. And don't forget to download the presentation and the handouts before we log off in a few minutes. But again, thank you to everyone who attended, our panelists, our moderator. Our next summit series will be on January 13th, and we will be discussing how nonprofit organizations can use debt to help fulfill their mission. And you can find information on that session in the handouts tab as well. I also want to remind everyone for our final session in March, we will have keynote speaker Mirsa Baradaran, who is the author of The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap. So she's been featured a lot in recent news about the much growing discussion of wealth disparities. And she recently was named an advisor for President-elect Joe Biden's economic transition team. So we're excited to have her in March, and we would love for you to register, and we will see you there. But until then, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope to see you again. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.